They designed huge skyscrapers, secret society halls, and even the monuments where presidents stand. But for decades, their names were kept off the plaques. One of them even had to hide in the shadows to see his own creation being built. Get ready, because we're about to rewrite the history books with the 20 architectural masterminds who truly built this country. 1. Robert Robinson Taylor. Imagine trying to build a school while you are still teaching the classes inside of it. That sounds like a nightmare, but for Robert Robinson Taylor, it was just a regular Tuesday. He holds the title of the very first accredited black architect in the United States, and his story starts way back in the late 1800s. He was a trailblazer who went to MIT, which is a super hard school to get into even today. When he arrived at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, he didn't just have a job to do. He had a mission. He teamed up with the famous Booker T. Washington to build a campus from the dirt up. And we mean that literally. The students at the school actually made the bricks that Robert used to design the buildings. It was a massive team effort. Robert designed over 25 buildings on that campus. One of the most beautiful ones was the chapel, which was a marvel of engineering for its time. He also designed the home where Booker T. Washington lived, known as the Oaks. The thing is, Robert wasn't just drawing pretty pictures on paper. He was creating a legacy. He worked with limited tools and money, yet he made buildings that stood strong for a century. He showed the whole country that African American students could build a world-class institution with their own hands. But while he was busy laying the foundation for black education in the South, another man was about to start designing churches that would become the heart of the civil rights movement. 2. Wallace Augustus Rayfield. If Robert Taylor was the master of the campus, Wallace Augustus Rayfield was the king of the church. He was the second professionally trained black architect in the country, and the amount of work he did is honestly mind-blowing. We are talking about over 400 buildings across 20 different states. It is hard to even imagine how much coffee he must have drank to get all that work done. He had a vision that went beyond just bricks and wood. He wanted to create spaces where people felt safe and powerful. His most famous project is the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. You might know this church because of the tragic events that happened there later during the civil rights struggles, but before that, it was a masterpiece of design. Wallace gave the building a strong, fortress-like look that made the community feel protected. He had a booming business and sent mail-order blueprints all over the country so that smaller towns could build nice churches too. Sadly, when the Great Depression hit the United States, his business took a huge hit. A lot of his drawings and records were lost to time, which is why so many people don't know his name today. He built the stages where history would happen, but he often stayed behind the curtain. And speaking of people connected to famous leaders, our next architect had a family connection that put a lot of pressure on his shoulders. 3. William Sidney Pitman. William Sidney Pitman was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, but he had a pretty big shadow looming over him. He was the son-in-law of Booker T. Washington. You can imagine the dinner table conversations were probably pretty intense. William was incredibly talented, and he did something that no black architect had done before him. He won a federal contract. That means the United States government hired him to design a building. This was for the Negro Building at the Jamestown Exposition in 1907. It was a huge deal because it showed the world that black architects could compete on the biggest stages. He later moved to Texas and started designing homes and community buildings there. He was known for being a bit stubborn and having a fiery temper, which sometimes got him into trouble, but his talent was undeniable. He designed the Pythian Temple in Dallas, which became a major hub for music and culture. The sad part is that despite his early success, he struggled in his later years and faded from the spotlight. He wanted to prove he was great on his own merits, not just because of who he married. He fought for respect every single day. But while William was fighting for his own spot, a pair of brothers in Tennessee were about to start a family business that would last for generations. 4. Moses McKissack III. Family businesses are tough. But Moses McKissack III and his brother Calvin built something that was practically a dynasty. Moses came from a long line of builders. His grandfather was actually a builder in West Africa who was brought to America, so construction was literally in his DNA. Moses set up shop in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was all about business. He helped found the very first black-owned architecture firm in the United States. They didn't just build small houses, they built major landmarks. One of their biggest achievements was winning a contract to build the 99th Pursuit Squadron Air Base at Tuskegee. This was a massive project during World War II, and getting it done on time and under budget was a huge win. It proved to the military and the government that black firms could handle massive, complex projects just as well as anyone else. Moses had a style that was strong and dependable, just like his company. The firm he started is still around today, which is amazing when you think about it. They have worked on huge modern projects like the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. Moses laid the first stone for a legacy that is still growing. But while Moses was building a loud and proud legacy, our next architect was designing some of the most famous buildings in America while being treated like a ghost. 5. Julian Abele. This story is going to make you shake your head. Julian Abele was the definition of a hidden genius. He was the chief designer at a very fancy firm in Philadelphia, but because of the color of his skin, the head of the firm usually took all the credit. Julian is the mastermind behind the beautiful campus of Duke University. If you have ever seen pictures of those stunning Gothic stone buildings and that massive chapel, that was Julian's brain at work. But here is the heartbreaking part. When the university opened, Julian couldn't even walk on the campus to admire his own work because of the segregation laws in the South. He had to visit in secret or look at photos. He also designed the Widener Library at Harvard, which is one of the most famous libraries in the world. For decades, students studied inside his creation without knowing his name. He was a man of high style and grace. He loved French architecture and brought that elegance to American cities. It wasn't until many years after he died that the universities finally admitted who really designed their iconic buildings. He was the man in the shadows making everything look beautiful. And speaking of beauty, our next architect found a way to turn ice and snow into art in one of the coldest cities in America. 6. Clarence W. Wiggington. When you think of architecture, you usually think of brick and steel, not frozen water. But Clarence W. Wiggington was a special kind of talent. He moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where it gets absolutely freezing. He became the first black municipal architect in the entire country. That means he worked for the city government designing public buildings. He designed schools, fire stations, and water towers that are still standing today. But his coolest work, literally, were the ice palaces for the St. Paul Winter Carnival. These were massive, magical castles made out of blocks of ice that lit up at night. They looked like something out of a fairy tale. Thousands of people would come to see them. It takes a special kind of brain to design a building that you know is going to melt away in a few months. Clarence left a huge mark on the city of St. Paul. There are over 60 of his buildings still standing there. He proved that a black architect could lead a city department and create structures that served everyone, from firefighters to school kids. He was a pillar of his community. But while Clarence was serving the public in the cold north, another architect was in New York, creating the ultimate symbol of luxury for the wealthiest black woman in America. 7. Vertner Woodson Tandy. Vertner Woodson Tandy was a man who liked the finer things in life. He was the first black architect registered in New York State, and he had a swagger about him. He is most famous for teaming up with Madam C.J. Walker. If you don't know her, she was the first self-made female millionaire in America, and she happened to be black. She wanted a house that would make everyone's jaw drop, and Vertner was the man for the job. He designed Villa Lawaro, a massive 34-room mansion in upstate New York. It was white, elegant, and looked like an Italian palace. It had a swimming pool, marble floors, and everything a millionaire could want. Building this house was a bold statement. It said that black success was real, and it was here to stay. Vertner didn't just design the house to be pretty, he designed it to show off power. He also designed the St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem, which became a landmark. Vertner was one of the founders of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, so he was all about brotherhood and excellence. He paved the way for black architects to enter the high-end luxury market. But not every architect was building mansions. Our next hero was focused on building a safe place for young men in a tough industrial city. 8. John Edmonston Brent. John Edmonston Brent is a name that is legendary in Buffalo, New York. He was the first black architect in that city, and he faced a lot of closed doors. but John was the kind of guy who would just build his own door if you didn't let him in. His most important project was the Michigan Avenue YMCA. Now, a YMCA might not sound as fancy as a mansion, but for the black community in Buffalo, it was a lifeline. This building was a place where black travelers could stay when other hotels turned them away. It was a place where young men could learn, play sports, and organize for their rights. John poured his heart into the design. He wanted it to be a place of pride. He also designed parks and gates for the Buffalo Zoo. He was a landscape architect as well as a building designer, which means he knew how to make the outdoors look good too. John spent a lot of his later years working for the government, designing parks and recreation areas. He believed that everyone deserved green spaces and beautiful surroundings, no matter where they lived. He was a quiet warrior for his community. And while John was building community centers, our next architect was designing mysterious halls for secret societies. 9. Louis Arnett, Stewart Bellinger. Louis Arnett Stewart Bellinger had a mysterious flair to his work. He operated mostly in Pittsburgh, and he was the go-to guy for designing buildings for secret fraternal orders. You see, back in the day, groups like the Knights of Pythias and the Odd Fellows were huge in the black community. They were places where men could network and support each other. Louis designed the Grand Lodge for the Knights of Pythias in Pittsburgh. This wasn't just a meeting hall, it was a massive structure that later became the New Granada Theater. It was the spot to be if you wanted to see jazz legends like Duke Ellington or Count Basie. Louis had a knack for creating spaces that could handle big crowds and big energy. His designs were intricate and detailed, much like the rituals of the societies he built them for. He also designed homes and churches, but his work on these social halls is what makes him stand out. He understood that people needed places to gather and celebrate their culture away from the prying eyes of the outside world. He gave them those sanctuaries. But if Louis was building for the community, our next architect was building for the stars, and he had to use a wild trick to do it. 10. Paul Revere Williams. This is the guy with the most incredible wow factor story on the list. Paul Revere Williams was known as the architect to the stars. He designed homes for Frank Sinatra, Lucille Ball, and Desi Arnaz. He practically defined the cool, glamorous look of Los Angeles. But getting there was a battle. Because he was black, many wealthy white clients were uncomfortable sitting next to him to look at drawings. So, Paul taught himself to draw upside down. He would sit across the desk from his clients, and while they watched, he would sketch their dream home perfectly upside down so they could see it right side up. It was a magic trick that won them over every time. It showed them he was a genius. He designed thousands of buildings, including the iconic theme building at LAX Airport. You know the one, it looks like a white flying saucer on 4 legs. Paul was the first black member of the American Institute of Architects. He worked on hotels, banks, and churches. He was smooth, charming, and incredibly talented. He proved that talent could break down even the toughest walls of prejudice. He reshaped the entire city of Los Angeles. But while Paul was charming Hollywood, our next architect was focusing on building the future minds of America. 11. Albert Irvin Cassell. Albert Irvin Cassell was a builder of campuses. He looked at a piece of land and saw a city of learning. He spent a lot of time working with Howard University in Washington, D.C. He wasn't just drawing one building at a time. He had a master plan. He wanted the campus to be beautiful, functional, and inspiring for the students who went there. He designed the Founders Library at Howard, which is a stunning brick building with a clock tower that watches over the campus. Albert had a huge vision that was almost too big for his time. He wanted to build a completely self-sustaining black community in Maryland called Chesapeake Heights. It was going to have beaches, homes, and shopping centers. Sadly, that project didn't fully happen because of financial issues and the Great Depression. But the dream was amazing. He also worked on campuses for Morgan State and Virginia Union University. He believed that the environment you studied in affected how well you learned. He wanted black students to walk through halls that felt important and dignified. He was building self-esteem through bricks and mortar. And speaking of dignity in living, our next architect changed the way public housing looked in America. 12. Hillyard Robinson. Hillyard Robinson believed that poor people deserve beautiful homes too. Before him, public housing often looked like prison blocks, cold, gray, and depressing. Hillyard wanted to change that. He traveled to Europe to study how they were building housing there, and he brought those modern ideas back to Washington, D.C. His masterpiece is the Langston Terrace dwellings. This wasn't just a housing project, it was art. He included sculptures of animals and families in the design. He created courtyards where kids could play safely. He thought about how sunlight would hit the windows. He wanted the people living there to feel proud of their home. Langston Terrace was the first federally funded housing project in D.C., and it set a new standard. Hillyard was a quiet intellectual who also taught architecture at Howard University. He influenced a whole generation of young students to think about the social impact of their work. He showed that architecture wasn't just for the rich, it was a tool for social justice. But while Hillyard was fighting for housing, a woman was about to shatter the glass ceiling in the male-dominated world of architecture. 13. Norma Merrick. Sklarek. Norma Merrick Sklarek is often called the Rosa Parks of architecture. She was a powerhouse. Being a woman in architecture was hard. Being a black woman was nearly impossible. But Norma didn't care about impossible. She became the first African-American woman to be elected a Fellow of the American Institute of Architects. She worked on huge, massive projects that you have definitely heard of. She was a production director, which means she was the one making sure the building actually got built correctly. She worked on Terminal 1 at LAX and the Pacific Design Center, which is that giant blue glass building in Hollywood. But her biggest claim to fame might be her work on the Mall of America. That is the biggest mall in the country, and Norma was a key leader in making it happen. She was known for being tough, smart, and incredibly organized. She had to be, because people were always waiting for her to fail. But she never did. She rose to the top of major firms and eventually co-founded her own all-female firm. She opened doors for women of color that had been welded shut. And speaking of women pioneers, our next architect was blazing trails on the international stage. 14. Beverly Lorraine Green. Beverly Lorraine Green didn't just break barriers, she smashed them. She is recorded as the first African-American woman to be licensed as an architect in the United States. That happened back in 1942. She started her career in Chicago, but she faced a lot of discrimination. People wouldn't hire her because she was black, and they wouldn't hire her because she was a woman. So, she moved to New York City to find better opportunities. There, she got to work on some truly global projects. She worked with a famous team on the design for the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, France. Imagine that. A black woman from Chicago helping to design a building for world peace in Paris. She also worked on buildings at New York University. Beverly died young, which is a tragedy because who knows what else she could have built. But her legacy is set in stone. She proved that black women belonged on the construction site and in the design studio. She was the first, but thanks to her, she wasn't the last. While Beverly was working on the world stage, our next architect was fighting to save the soul of his local community. 15. Robert Traynham Coles. Robert Traynham Coles was a fighter. He was from Buffalo, New York, and he saw how urban renewal projects were often destroying black neighborhoods instead of helping them. He decided to become an architect to protect his community. He opened his own firm in 1963, making it one of the oldest black-owned firms in the Northeast. He didn't just want to build buildings, he wanted to build power. He designed the Frank E. Meriwether Jr. Library in Buffalo, which is a stunning building designed to look like an African village. It is a masterpiece of cultural design. He also worked on the Health and Hospitals Corporation in New York City and designed major expansions for Harlem Hospital. He wanted his buildings to reflect the culture of the people using them. Robert was also a big leader in the American Institute of Architects, pushing them to be more diverse. He was constantly telling the big shots that they needed to pay attention to the inner cities. He was an activist with a drafting pencil. And speaking of heavy emotional projects, our next architect worked on the most sensitive site in American history. 16. J. Max Bond Jr. J. Max Bond Jr. was a man who understood history and pain. He was one of the most prominent black architects of the modern era. He spent time working in Ghana, Africa, right after it became independent. That experience gave him a deep connection to his roots. When he came back to America, he became a dean at architecture schools and a leader in the field. But his most famous and difficult task came after the tragedy of September 11th. He was part of the team that designed the museum section of the National September 11 Memorial and Museum in New York City. This was a job that required incredible sensitivity. He had to create a space underground where people could remember the victims and understand the horror of that day without feeling overwhelmed. He also designed the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta. Max was the guy you called when the building needed to have a soul. He understood that architecture was about memory and feeling. He helped shape the way we remember our heroes and our tragedies. But while Max was dealing with the past, our next architect was trying to build a utopian future. Number 17. Harvey Bernard Gantt. Harvey Bernard Gantt is a name that is famous for two things: politics and buildings. Before he was an architect, he was the first black student to attend Clemson University in South Carolina. He had to sue the school to get in, and he won. That bravery showed what kind of man he was. After graduating, he became a successful architect and eventually the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. But his most interesting architectural idea was Soul City. He worked on the plans for this experimental community in North Carolina. It was supposed to be a place built by black people, for black people, where they could have economic freedom and equality. It was a bold, futuristic idea. While Soul City didn't become the utopia they hoped for, the planning and the vision were groundbreaking. Harvey designed many public buildings in Charlotte, including the Afro-American Cultural Center. He mixed his love for design with his passion for civil rights. He showed that you could be a politician and a creator at the same time. He is a living legend who changed the South. And speaking of the South, we have to go back to the McKissack family for another member who helped win a war. 18. Calvin Lunsford McKissack. We talked about the firm, but we have to stop and give Calvin Lunsford McKissack his own moment in the spotlight. While his brother Moses was often the face of the operation, Calvin was the engine. He was the younger brother, but in many ways he was the backbone that kept the family business standing tall. He wasn't just drawing pretty pictures, he was a registered architect who understood the nuts and bolts of engineering. He knew exactly how to take a dream and turn it into steel and concrete. You have to understand the family history here to get why Calvin was so driven. He came from a line of master builders. His father and grandfather had learned the trade while enslaved, passing down secrets of construction from generation to generation. Calvin took that legacy and professionalized it. He brought the technical education and the business smarts that turned a local reputation into a national powerhouse. Then came the ultimate test: World War II. The United States government needed a training facility for a new experimental group of pilots. These were the Tuskegee Airmen. The stakes were incredibly high. There were plenty of people in the War Department who didn't believe black pilots could fly, and they didn't believe black contractors could build. If the base wasn't built perfectly, or if it wasn't finished on time, the critics would use it as an excuse to shut the whole program down. Calvin Lunsford McKissack took on this pressure personally. The contract was massive, worth millions of dollars in today's money. It wasn't just a few buildings, it was an entire airbase. They had to build barracks for the soldiers to sleep in, huge hangars for the planes, and perfectly graded runways for takeoff and landing. And they had to do it fast. Calvin was on the ground, overseeing the details. He managed the crews, checked the supplies, and made sure every inch of that base was up to military code. When the base opened, it was flawless. The Tuskegee Airmen went on to become legends of the sky, but they launched their missions from the ground that Calvin helped build. He proved that when the country was in trouble, black architects were ready to serve, and they could handle the biggest jobs in the nation. After the war, Calvin didn't slow down. He shifted his focus to the community. He built schools and churches all over Tennessee. He was a quiet professional who didn't need to shout to be heard. He let his buildings do the talking. He solidified the McKissack name as the gold standard, proving that they weren't just lucky, they were the best. From the dusty airfields of Alabama, we are going to head north to the windy streets of Chicago for a record-breaking tower. 19. John Warren Mutusami. John Warren Mutusami didn't just want to build houses, he wanted to touch the sky. He was working in Chicago, a city famous for inventing the skyscraper. If you were an architect in Chicago, you were playing in the big leagues. But for a long time, the downtown skyline was off limits to designers who looked like John. He decided to change that. He became the mastermind behind the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters. Now, if you don't know Johnson Publishing, you definitely know what they created. Ebony, and Jet magazines. For decades, these were the most important magazines in Black America. They sat on coffee tables in living rooms from New York to Los Angeles. A company that important needed a headquarters that made a statement. John designed a building that screamed success. Located on Michigan Avenue, right on the famous Magnificent Mile, this was prime real estate. It was the first time a Black architect had designed a high-rise building in downtown Chicago. That was a huge glass ceiling to break. The building itself is a masterpiece. It stands 11 stories tall, simple, strong, and elegant. It doesn't have a bunch of fancy, unnecessary decorations on the outside. It is modern and sleek. But inside, it was a different world. John designed it to be a symbol of Black corporate power. The interiors were colorful and vibrant, reflecting the culture of the magazines. It had test kitchens for recipes, art galleries, and executive offices that rivaled anything on Wall Street. When people walked down Michigan Avenue surrounded by banks and hotels, they would look up and see this tower. It told the world that Black business had arrived, and it wasn't hiding in the back anymore. It was looking down from the top floor. John Warren Mutasamy was versatile too. He didn't just do skyscrapers. He designed massive college campuses and urban housing projects. He could design a home for a family or a lecture hall for thousands of students. But that tower on Michigan Avenue is his monument. It stands as physical proof that talent can break through any barrier if given the chance. And finally, we come to a man who looked around at the industry and realized that success isn't worth much if you are the only one at the party. 20. Wendell Jerome Campbell. Wendell. Jerome Campbell was a brilliant architect, but he realized something troubling early in his career. Being a Black architect was a very lonely job. Even by the 1960s and 70s, there weren't many of them. They often worked in white-dominated firms where they felt isolated, or they struggled to get the loans and insurance needed to start their own businesses. The doors were technically open, but they were still heavy to push. Wendell decided that enough was enough. He didn't just want to build structures, he wanted to build a support system. So, he took action. He became one of the key founders of the National Organization of Minority Architects, known as NOMA. This wasn't just a social club, it was a survival network. The group was created to help Black architects find each other. It gave them a place to trade advice, share job leads, and fight for fair treatment in the industry. Before NOMA, if you hit a roadblock, you were on your own. After NOMA, you had an army of professionals behind you. But don't think Wendell Jerome Campbell was just an organizer. He was a heavy hitter in design, too. He landed massive contracts, including major renovations for McCormick Place in Chicago. If you've never been, McCormick Place is the biggest convention center in North America. It's huge. Working on a project that size requires incredible skill and planning. Wendell also had a different philosophy about city planning. In the past, when cities wanted to run-down neighborhood, they usually just bulldozed it and kicked the poor people out. Wendell hated that. He focused on urban planning that helped cities upgrade neighborhoods without destroying the community. He believed you should rebuild for the people living there, not just push them aside. His biggest legacy, however, is the organization he helped build. Because of his vision, young Black architects today have mentors. They have role models they can actually talk to. They don't have to feel like they are the only ones in the room anymore. Wendell made sure that the next generation would have a smoother ride than he did. He built a network that is stronger than steel and longer lasting than stone.